the first and the most important thing, let's discuss first about the paper. Now, many of you might be repeaters, many of you might be attempting this the first time, but consider this session that you are attempting for the first time. Don't consider that you are a repeater. Don't consider that. Consider that you are attempting this paper for the first time. There is a psychological impact within ACCA and all other professional examination. Students who assume and think that they are repeaters, definitely they won't have the required energy and motivation to study for this paper, and this has been witnessed by many of my students. So I would recommend you that consider that this is not your repetitive attempt. It's basically your new attempt. You are going to attempt this paper for the first time. Okay, coming back. Now the history of this paper was used to be called ACCA F8 previously, and now Audit and Assurance. So this is one of the thing. And secondly, as you all know that this is part of your skills module. And when we talk about skills module, it's basically basic and its application. Now, some of you might ask that why do we have a very low passing rate? Now, let me explain that from the examination and the examiner's point of view as well. So, in this attempt, luckily, we had 41% passing ratio. And that's basically a very good passing ratio as compared to your last 5 passing ratios that on an average were around 37 to 38%. So considering that, it's basically a very good passing ratio. Maybe because one of the reasons that I witnessed, students were attempting this paper from home. Not only this paper, but other papers as well. There is a psychological impact when you go to the examination hall, you see everyone around you studying. And you see someone studying some other topic and automatically you will assume pressures. And that will be reflected in your examinations as well. You see the other person, he's keep on writing and you don't know. So basically that is an area where students can easily catch stress and all these things. So maybe that was one of the reasons that ACCA was able to produce 41%, and maybe the examiner, since it was the first attempt, maybe the examiner had given some leverage to the students. Like it's not a very good improvement over last attempts, but still it's a very good improvement. Now, this is with respect to the ACCA. Now, why do we have such a low passing rate? If you compare this with SBL, if you compare this with SBR, they are over 50%, but not this paper. Why? Several reasons are there. The first reason is your BSc OBU, right? At first, there was a paper F4 that was based on that paper, student was either eligible for BSc OBU. But now that has changed from F4 to Audit and Assurance. So one of the reasons why this paper is very important for the examiner, because it is a basis for your BSc OBU thesis. Second, this paper actually prepares you for your strategic management papers. That's your SBL, your SBR, and your further optional papers. The third important reason is, and this is the very important reason, because after your skills module, you are expected to work in the audit firm. How many of you agree with me? You are expected to work in the audit firm once you are through your skills paper. How many of you agree with me? And I would also want someone who is currently working in the firm, I would want to tell me that how's the experience so far working in the audit firm, and what is their paper status as of now. And there is also one thing that we would be discussing, and most of the students were asking me that what is that. the CWR approach. We'll be discussing that as well. But as of now, so examiner expects you to work in the audit firm once you are through your skills module. Now, skills module includes the audit and assurance. And what do you do when you go to an audit firm? You are expected to perform an audit. So examiner wants you to be well equipped with the auditing techniques, the auditing understandings, financial reporting. So this is the reason why this is very important for the examiner, and students who pass this paper actually know what audit is all about, right? And secondly, there is one more paper, Advanced Audit and Assurance. Examiner also knows that there would be some students who won't opt for Advanced Audit and Assurance since it's an optional paper. So it means that student who won't opt for Advanced Audit and Assurance, he or she is studying this paper for the last time. That's why examiner has a very close importance towards this paper, and the essence, the crux of this particular association is audit and assurance, in fact. That's why this paper is very, very important from the examinations point of view. And its placement is also very important. You see, all the strategic papers, when you complete all that, it has been placed after all that, because this is the final deliverable that you are providing to your client, right? Be it audit and assurance, be it advanced audit and assurance, that's the deliverable that you are providing. What's that? The audit report that includes the integration and implementation of all what you have studied from FIA to your ACCA, right? So this is basically the structure, and you might know that why examiner has considered this as very important. So we have covered this area. Now, if we see the syllabus, how many areas do we have? We have 5 areas. The first one is audit framework. The second is your audit risk. Third is your internal controls. Fourth, audit evidence. And fifth, review and reporting. Now, if we discuss from the examinations point of view, what are the important areas that examiner most focus on? If I mark here with a tick, it means that it's very important. Now, 2 ticks means very, very important. Okay, so I've marked these 3 areas, 2, 3 and 4 with double ticks. Reason being that you can get around 20 to 25 marks from this area from in your section B. Same goes for here, around 20 to 22, and here around 20 marks. So if you just calculate on an average, around 60 to 70 marks are being asked from these 3 areas. And these are the areas where students are most confused because they don't know this approach. This approach specifically applies on these 3 areas, but it also applies on your first and your last area as well. We will elaborate this particular concept a bit later, but we need to understand the importance of ACCA. Risk, very important. Internal controls, integral part of your audit and assurance. You cannot assess the risk without considering the internal controls. You know how many of you know this? How many of you know this? Can someone explain me that what is this? It's not a practical paper, but what this equation is all about. If I ask a very general understanding, see, if you can explain something in a very simplest way, it means that you know that topic very very thoroughly. So let me explain you this audit risk, very general understanding in 2 minutes. Now, who is facing this audit risk? Who would face this audit risk? Is it the management who's facing this audit risk? Is it the shareholders who's facing this audit risk? Or is it the auditor who's facing this audit risk? So we need to establish first that who is facing this risk. The auditor is facing this audit risk. Now, if you see this particular area, inherent risk, control risk, detection risk. What is inherent risk? Inherent risk is something that's embedded. It would be inherently risky. Example, IFRS 9. Example, IS 2. Example, IS 16, reevaluation. Example, IS 40 to IS 16. Why? Because they are inherently risky. The calculation is very complex. And it's very, very easy that management might have made mistakes in their calculations or in their workings. So that's the inherent risk. Collusion between employees, management override of controls as well. It's part of your inherent risk. Right? That's the inherent risk. That this is the risk that would be there. You cannot eliminate this risk at all. This would be there. You should assume that there is an inherent risk. Now, this depends on the industry as well. For example, the revenue recognition criteria for a service industry is actually difficult to calculate as compared to the revenue recognition criteria for a manufacturing concern, right? Because the percentage completion is basically something that you are calculating or the client is calculating in a service industry, right? Not in a manufacturing based industry. But when we talk about manufacturing industry, we know that there is another inherent risk, that's the IS2 inventories that we don't have in the service industry. So inherent risk would also change from industry to industry, company to company. So there are some aspects that would remain the same, but on the other hand, it would depend on industry to industry. Control risk, it's a very broad area, and control risk means the application of the internal controls. So internal control, who is responsible for the internal controls? Is it the auditor? Or is it the management? Or is it the shareholders? Who is responsible for internal controls? Management. Okay, definitely, right.
Management.
Definitely, a good answer. This is controls placed by client, right? Why? Why do they have this control? Okay, let me change the question. Why do they need this control? Yes, that's one answer. Others can comment on this, that why do management need? Like auditor would use the application of the control risk, right? But why do management actually need internal controls? I'm asking from the management's point of view, not the auditor's point of view. Auditor is there to assess the control risk.
To see the true picture of financial statements.
That's from the auditor's perspective. If I ask you that why internal control is important for a company, is it just because the auditor would actually use their controls? Is it just because that, or does this internal control serve some other purposes as well? Why do management need internal controls? Now, students, this is the point where most of the
risk in financial transactions.
Okay, financial transactions, that's one point. But other than financial transactions, do you think that company needs this internal control? Do you think that it fulfills any purpose other than financial statements? Do you think that this fulfills any purpose? Or is it just only relevant for the financial statements? Then if it's only relevant for the financial statements, it would mean that this is only there because the auditor is asking or the auditor is evaluating. It has no use for the management. Is that so?
Nope.
Okay, if we move transactions now, if we move financial transactions, if we move financial statements, if we move general ledger, trial balance, everything, what is the purpose of internal controls in a company? If I ask you just one line definition, what would you tell me that what is the purpose of this particular statement, internal controls? How do you see internal controls? You have considered only one part of this internal controls, that cats. If I see from a broader perspective, why do company need internal controls?
In order to achieve organization's objectives
Bingo.
overall.
Bingo. Definitely. This is the company, this is internal controls.
There is a asset loss,
Yeah.
and so the information is complete and accurate. Financial statements are reliable, and it is conducted in accordance with the applicable laws and regulations.
See,
That's
you
right.
are again considering that from the auditor's point of view. I am asking that why company needs internal controls. You are giving me answer
To
for this control risk.
minimize business risk.
Minimize business risks. Now, when we talk about business risk, are they different from the audit risk? Is that so?
Yes.
How they are different from the audit risk? How would you define, like if I ask you what's the difference between the audit risk and the business risk, what would be your answer? Are they same? Are they different?
Business risk includes, I think, inherent risks or
Okay,
in
let's start
in
from
the
the very
audit
scratch.
risk.
Let's
Yes.
start from your FIA studies. Let's go back in time. FIA. Now you are in your F1. What's the purpose of the organization? What's the purpose? You have been through all the ACC journey. What's the purpose of the organization? Why do organizations establish? What is the objective behind? To achieve?
Organization goals.
To achieve? Organizations? Goals? Objectives? What else?
Profit maximization.
Profit maximization. Profit maximization. For whom? For whom profit maximization? For whom are we doing this profit maximization? For shareholders. For shareholders. For shareholders. Now, what is auditor doing here? What is auditor doing here? Okay, what is auditor doing here? Why the auditor need to evaluate the audit risk?
To ensure that the shareholders are not cheated, or you can say.
Yes, you are providing an independent review. Let's first consider this. Achieve organizational structures. Back in time in FIA, the purpose of the business, the definition of business, organization as a whole, the purpose is to achieve business objectives. For whom? For the shareholders. Now, whom are you reporting to? When you complete the audit, whom are you reporting to? You are reporting to shareholders. So despite of being very different purposes, you see the objective is still the same. Despite of being very different purposes, the objectives are still the same. So students ask that why internal controls in audit and assurance? Because they have the same objectives. And if you see the drafting side, internal controls has a very different drafting as compared to the audit risk question. Students tend to get very confused. Why do we have a very different drafting in internal controls? Mostly students would say that in internal controls, they are somehow thinking that they are considering themselves in the company's position. They are not considering themselves as the auditors. They are considering themselves as part of the management. Why? Because the purpose of the internal controls is to achieve business objectives. Now, if company wants to achieve business objectives, you need to assess some risks. Now, those are the business risks that one of the students answered. To handle these business risks, to manage these business risks, we need internal controls. Right? We need internal controls to manage our business risks. Because if we manage our business risks, we would be able to achieve our organizations, which in turn would benefit our shareholders. And that's what is the purpose of corporate governance, right? It's also part of your syllabus, right? Purpose of corporate governance. Again, systems means so that the company can achieve its objectives. Internal controls, ways in which you can achieve business objectives, means systems, policies, procedures. You might have known SOPs. What are SOPs? Standard operating procedures, policies, procedures, manuals. You heard this thing. These are all part of your internal controls that are placed at a client so that the client, the management, can achieve their business objectives. Right? And in turn, these objectives would be shown in the form of financial statements. So here is the point where this internal control is actually important for the auditor, because the application of those internal controls would in turn be reported in the form of financial statements that the auditor would review, would perform audit on. So that's the control risk. That's the reason why in the internal control question you have to answer from a very different perspective, and in the audit risk question you are answering from a very different perspective. Ultimately, everything is reflected in the financial statements, but what's the purpose and how it goes? Objective is the same. Corporate governance, be it internal control, be it audit risk, be it audit report. Purpose is the same, that you have to serve the shareholders. But since they are related to the business, they cannot provide shareholders with an independent opinion. It's a self-review threat in the audit terms, right? Self-review threat. You would have studied this in the ethics area. So why do we need audit? We need audit because we know that they are working for the shareholders' objectives, but they would face this self-review threat. And based on that, now we need an independent organization that would come in and perform the audit. Now, since auditor is independent, it doesn't only have to go through the audit risk. It also has to go through ethics principles as well. Ethics and acceptance, right? You might have also heard and learned about the ethics and acceptance. So, they have to go through this ethics and acceptance as well in order to evaluate whether they are eligible for this engagement. And once they have fulfilled all the ethical responsibilities, then they will be performing audits. Now, there is one more concept of negligence that is basically because either the auditor is not ethically sound, he was not able to accept the ethical responsibilities he had, and secondly, he was not able to perform the audit effectively. So basically, the auditor could be held negligible because of either of the two reasons. That's why it's very important that the auditor tests himself for the ethics and acceptance, and to test him or herself for the resources and for the technical competence he or she should have. In the audit risk question, you might have seen, this is your first year audit. This is the first client. Why do we always write in the response that interim audit? Why do we always write in the response that thorough procedures? Why do we also always write in the answers that team with the relevant experience? Why? This is the part of the ethics and acceptance that you need to fulfill first, and then you can perform audit. You need relevant people for the relevant job, right? You cannot call an electrician to repair your car, right? You need to call an auto mechanic to repair your car, right? So I guess this is clear. So how many of you are clear with this? Maybe you would have like got a flow that how the audit moves. Shall we move forward? Shall we proceed?
No, sir, can you just continue on the audit risk, which is equals to inherent risk? I understood the inherent risk, and what's the next one?
The next one is the control risk that I just explained now.
Yes, and the DR.
DR is the detection risk. Now, the ball is actually in the court of the auditor. The auditor would have to detect. Now, based on the audit risk evaluation, the auditor would assume that how much audit risk the auditor is actually facing. If that's, you might have heard, acceptably low level, what does that mean? Audit risk can never be zero. Why? I told you that inherent risk can never eliminate. Even though if the company has effective internal controls, even if I talk about Google, Facebook, all these companies, they might have the best internal controls for their businesses, but still their control risk won't ever be zero because it's a risk. Risk cannot be eliminated, it can only be reduced. Same for the inherent risk, the control risk. It means that there is a risk that the auditor needs to manage. Now, if the inherent and the control risks are high, the only job the auditor has is to reduce the detection risk, right? Is to reduce the detection risk. How? By performing procedures, by reducing the materiality levels, by increasing the sample size, so many things. By working on more procedures, by performing substantive analytical procedures, by performing substantive procedures and further audit procedures, if the auditor needs to perform on them. And in that case, if the auditor is able to reduce the detection risk, since these all three are multiplying together, it means that the audit risk would also reduce because they are in fact product of each other. So detection risk is basically an application of the audit evidence. Control risk is the application of the internal controls, and your audit risk is the application of the audit risk. Now, all your three areas that are examined for around 60 to 70 marks are based on this definition. If you understand this definition, if you understand how this flows, you would be able to create a link between these topics. And then once you create a link, when you know how to create a link, you would be able to use this CWR concept. Right? Any questions so far with respect to this equation?
Sir, do we start with audit evidence because writing audit procedures it will help a lot?
Yeah, definitely. We'll be doing the audit evidence. See, today we are basically discussing the CWR approach, but I'll also consider the audit evidence. The audit procedures are something that students are most confused with. They don't know how to write procedures, what procedures to write, and how a procedure should be written. Now, if I give you a very small example, some of you might know about this, that if I have say buildings in my statement of financial position, the value is, for example, $1,000, and you are provided with the draft financial statements. This is the extracts of your draft financial statements, and you see buildings there amounting to $1,000. The auditor needs to verify this. Now, considering that now we are performing the procedures, we have performed the risk assessment procedures, we need to perform the substantive procedures over buildings, right? The first and the foremost important thing that the student needs to know, that what audit procedures, or again, what is the objective? The objective is that the auditor should obtain sufficient, appropriate audit evidence. Why? To conclude that the buildings actually valued at $1,000. Because the auditor is performing the audit on these financial statements, and when these financial statements in turn would go to the shareholders, once the auditor performed their audit responsibilities, the shareholders would see buildings valued at $1,000. And in the audit report, it will state that the financial statements give a true and fair view. So how the auditor actually concluded that the financial statements give a true and fair view? Because he had performed procedures He didn't stick himself till here. No, he has detected as well. He has reduced audit risk as well. And once the auditor has reduced the audit risk, how many of you agree that this is not in the control of the auditor? If you say yes, I'll just tick it. How many of you say that inherent risk is not in the control of the auditor?
No,
Definitely.
it's not.
And how many of you would say that in the control risk is also not in control of the auditor? Is it in the control of the auditor or is it not in the control of the auditor?
It's not in the control of the auditor.
Not in the control of the auditor. Why? Because the responsibility of internal controls is whose responsibility is management. That's why since management has placed the internal controls, the auditor has no control over the control risk. Finally, we have this thing, detection risk. This is where the auditor needs to work the most. If the auditor has evaluated that the risk is high, he needs to lower down the detection risk in order to reduce the audit risk. So it means when you need to reduce the detection risk, you need to perform more procedures. You need to perform more procedures on buildings. You need to perform more procedures on every area of audit where there is a risk of material misstatement. If we collectively call this inherent and control risk, is the risk of material misstatement, because this risk of material misstatement would be in the financial statements before performing any audit procedure by the auditor. These controls were placed by the client, and these in turn, the objectives in turn would be reflected in the form of the financial report. How would you share with the shareholders that how much you have achieved via financial statements? Before going towards the shareholders, this is first audited by the auditors as per the benchmarks. What are the benchmarks? IFRS, ISAs, and legal regulations applicable in that particular jurisdiction. These are three mainly benchmarks against which the auditor performs audit, whether the financial statements give a true and fair view. Understood this? Okay. So if we say about buildings, the auditor is concluding that I have obtained sufficient and appropriate audit evidence that the buildings reflected in the company's balance sheet is valued at $1,000. How the auditor is so confirmed? How the auditor is so much confident? He states the financial statements give a true and fair view. Why? How? Because he has performed thorough procedures in order to detect this risk, in order to reduce this risk. And the auditor has reduced the risk. And when he's reduced the risk, it means that now, how? Because he had obtained the sufficient and appropriate audit evidence that was actually required in that scenario. Right? Why? Because every company would face a very different audit risk. Every auditor in a very different organization, in a very different sector, with a very different team, might face different audit risks. And it all depends upon the professional judgment. I cannot give a number that what is acceptably low level for the auditor. It's based on professional judgment. How much materiality? What should be the sample size? Based on professional judgment. So, sufficient and appropriate audit evidence, and when the auditor concludes that he has obtained the sufficient and appropriate audit evidence that building exists at $1,000, it means that if I talk about this figure, it shows a true and fair view of the company's affairs. Company has buildings worth $1,000. Now, the auditor must have to do something in order to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. Yes? What's that? The audit procedures. When the auditor performs procedures, the audit procedures known as substantive procedures. We know that we have 7 substantive procedures. Not going into detail of that. Substantive procedures. Now, once the auditor performs these substantive procedures, the auditor would in turn say that I have obtained sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. Right? Obtained. You will perform procedure, you will obtain an evidence. Right? I went to buy a used car with one of my friends who is also an auto mechanic. The mechanic knows what should be the sound of a new car when it starts. It means that turning on the ignition, moving wrist on the clockwise side and starting the car is the procedure, right? And the sound that comes from the engine is the evidence. It means that the auditor would perform procedures and in return, the evidence the auditor is receiving, the auditor would evaluate whether it is sufficient and appropriate to conclude that the buildings actually exist at $1,000. So, procedures, let's be very specific. If I want to perform procedures over buildings, let's consider I want to perform existence procedures over the buildings. Now, what is existence? Existence is an assertion. Now, when you ask yourself that what audit procedures should I perform in order to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence, the answer is that which assertion you are targeting to. We all know that since it's a balance sheet item, it has assertions like existence, completeness, classification, valuation, cut off somehow because it gives an evidence of completeness as well. Rights and obligations. These are basically some of the assertions that you need to verify when you are performing the audit on a balance sheet figure. Now, if I consider this existence, if I want to verify the existence of the building, how would I verify the existence? First question, is it a tangible or an intangible, this fixed asset? Is it a tangible or intangible?
Tangible.
Tangible. It means
Tangible.
it means that I can see. And you might have seen in the procedures, physically inspect. What does that mean? Go and look at the building. Since it's a tangible fixed asset, you can go and look at the building. What's the procedure for that? What is the procedure? Physically inspect the building. Physically inspect the building to what? Now, if students who would write this statement, physically inspect the buildings, he won't get marks. He would get 0.5 marks because you need to write the purpose why you wrote this procedure. What's the purpose? What are you trying to verify when you are writing this procedure? You are verifying the existence. It means that if I write, we have space here. Physically inspect the building. And if I stop here and if I move towards the second procedure, examiner would only give me 0.5 marks because there is no purpose mentioned here. Examiner would need purpose, why you wrote this procedure. Then you would write to verify what? To verify what? Why are you performing this procedure? What it would verify? Existence. You are performing these procedures to verify existence. Now the examiner would give you 1 mark. Now this is basically how you should write the procedures. There's some other procedures for valuation as well. We'll not go into that because the main crux, but definitely students who have any concerns, they can definitely come up to me for the procedures, for the auditors, the internal controls, no issues with that. We also have, later on, we'll have the crash course for the audit and assurance. You can also enroll for that later on. Okay, coming back. Physically inspect the building to verify the existence. You'll get 1 mark for this procedure. Why? Because it has 3 elements that the examiner wants. First, the verb. The verb. What you are doing. What you are doing. You are inspecting. You are physically inspecting. That's the verb. On what? On what? On the building. So that's the source. 3 things that you need to ensure when you are writing the procedure. Physically inspect, that's the verb. That's the work you are doing. On what? What is the source? The source is the building. Why? The most important question. Why? That's the third point. The assertion, the purpose of that procedure. This is how you would write the procedures and would secure marks. Okay, so the most important discussion, this CWR approach, most of you students are here just to get a glimpse of this area. Now, what do we mean by C, W, and R. So I would again like to thank Suraj and Prerna. You definitely give. Anyone who wants to ask, do we have them? Okay. Anyone who wants to ask any question from Prerna, or you think that it's cleared and we can move towards this new concept? Shall we move towards this new concept, or shall we wait?
Yes, I think we're briefly.
Okay. So this CWR, what's this CWR? Now, when I say C, it means conceptually linked. When I say W, it means writing and drafting. And when I say R, it means relevancy principle. And is it important that we should consider these three elements in isolation or together? So I'll explain each and everything, and then we'll see whether do we need to understand this in isolation or collectively as a single word. Okay, conceptually linked. What does that mean? It answers your what. It answers your what. Means what you need to write, what understanding, what knowledge you need to have in order to clear this exam. Definitely the study course, the course understanding, the course material, be it some students would go for BBP, some students would go for Kaplan, whatever you want to choose, there isn't any restriction. You should see both books are very important in their own aspects. Students who prefer BBP or they have been studying BBP since start, they should and go for BBP because now they have an understanding. Those who are studying from Kaplan, it's okay. Both are acceptable. Okay, so that's what. Then we have the drafting and writing skills. What does that mean? How to write. How to write. Students know, many students know, they go through BBP, they go through Kaplan, they actually rote learn each and everything. But when it comes to how to write, they are blank. So they have everything in their head, but when it comes to put that on a piece of paper, on a computer system, they are very blank that how to start. What should be the approach, how to start. They don't know anything about that. Most of them get the strategies or they memorize the past paper answers, but that's basically question wise. You don't know what to write conceptually in that particular scenario. The last is the relevancy. How much to write? How much to write? In the audit risk scenario question, there are many students. I have checked the answers of many students. When they write the response to the audit risk, it's a page long, you know. The examiner doesn't require you to write that much. You are writing the response for 1 mark. When you're writing the response for 1 mark, it should be around 2 to 3 lines and specific. When I say 2 to 3 lines and specific, it means that you are utilizing the relevancy concept. When I say what to write, how to write, what should be the drafting skills, what procedures. Now this is basically the writing skill, how to write, a procedure, utilizing each and everything. This is basically what, right? If you don't know what is existence, how would you write this procedure? So it's the C. Then how to write? I told you that you need to ensure that there should be 3 elements. Firstly, the verb. Secondly, the source. And thirdly, the purpose. That's the writing and drafting. And finally, how much to write. This is very specific. You don't need to write more than that explaining that why are you performing this procedure or what's the address of this building, right? Just a minute. हाँ मैं छोड़ दूंगा, मसला नहीं यार, 15-20 मिनट है तकरीबन। चलो ठीक है, कोई मसला नहीं, कोई मसला नहीं। हाँ okay students, so CWR, I utilize this concept, this audit procedures concept, and this is not only applicable on this. When you are writing the audit risk, scenario based answer, audit risk and its response, again you need to consider whether you have utilized these three strategies. So basically this is the golden rule to pass the audit and assurance. What you can do, you have 1 month, study an area. If you are taking classes from somewhere, take the classes. But you should make a checklist for yourself. For every answer that you attempt, see whether you are able to use this element along with the drafting requirements, and finally how much to write. The students are normally confused here, how much to write. Somehow they know what strategies and what exam tips they need to ensure in the exams. They also know this area as well. Most students know conceptual, but they lack in W and R. Most students know C and W, but they lack in R. But when they lack in R, it means that they will not be able to complete their paper on time. They'll be writing irrelevant stuff. Now that also has another risk. If that irrelevant stuff is wrong, examiner would know that you have just written, and this is basically a case where there are some students who would write everything just in case that any one thing would be correct. So examiner won't mark you for that. If they require 5 procedures, students would write 9 procedures, considering that any 5 of them would be correct. No, that's not how the ACCA examiner would assess your exam. They would check the relevancy principle. The first 5 procedures the examiner would check and would mark you on that. The rest 4 procedures, the examiner would remove that. There are some cases where the examiner would give you credit for that as well. But we should consider that we need to utilize these 3 elements together. And believe me, if you will exercise these 3 elements. Now this was not covered in the previous sessions or in the previous crash courses. This is being covered today, first time, because it took me some time to come up to this particular strategy. How to pass the exam. You need to ensure that you have completed this CWR approach for every area, be it the audit framework. There are areas like the ethics and the corporate governance from where you get around 5 to 10 marks in a scenario based environment. Corporate governance weaknesses and how to improve that, recommendations. The ethics side, you need to identify and evaluate the ethics and write its appropriate safeguards. Very important for the audit risk, scenario based question. What you should know about the audit risk? You should know about the application, the understanding of the case itself. Writing drafting skills, how to approach the audit question, how to approach the audit risk question, how to identify the risk. Students also have this issue that they're able to identify the risk, but they're not able to correctly write how it should be written. So again, somehow writing and the relevancy concept, what and how much to write. So it's very important that you utilize these 3 strategies. Now this will apply everywhere in any case, in every case of your syllabus. You need to ensure this element. Every question has a very different drafting skill. I told you, because internal controls are implemented by the company. They have a drafting skill from the perspective of the business objectives and how it would have impact on the financial statements. That's secondary. But when it comes to audit risk scenario based question, this is what should come into your mind, because the audit risk is basically the product of inherent risk, control risk, and detection risk. So anything out of these three would be your audit risk instead. For example, if there is a new client for me, new client is not an inherent risk or not a control risk. New client is a detection risk for me. Why? Because now it's in my control. How? If there is a new client and if I ask my client to start the interim audit, there might be a case that the risks associated with the first client, what's the risk? Understanding. You'll have to get a proper understanding. How you would ensure that you get a proper understanding? If you get more time to audit, right? If you get more time to audit, you will have a better understanding. So interim audit would work there where the client is new. So it's the detection risk. It's not the inherent or control risk. Some students write inherent risk because the client is new. Somehow it is, but it's in your court as well. How? If you go for the interim audit, or if you design an audit team that includes the experienced personnel that have knowledge of that particular industry. For example, there is a new client. Now new client could also mean new business. Now new business means that the audit firm would have to see whether itself a pool of resources, whether they have the resources that have the competency related to that industry or business, and if they have, they can utilize that. It means again detection risk. So that is in the control of the auditor. That's why I ask the very first place that what out of these are in the control of the auditor. Only detection risk. So strategies, how to answer, how much to write, what to write, how to write, and how much to write. If you utilize these skills, you will be able to excel in your exams. I would say it's a very high time that you start this approach. I would say the repeaters that have scored around 40s, in their 40s, I would want them to use this approach right away. For students who are attempting this paper for the first time and they are doing self-study, they can approach me and I'll definitely guide you on how to ensure this approach. Students who have scored below 40 in their 30s or 20s, I would want to say that change your strategy. Move from theoretical covering, or just if you are just covering theoretically, if you are just going through PVP and Kaplan and going in the exams, that's not the correct strategy. You need to practice the exam papers as well. You need to simulate the exam papers as well. So again, using this strategy, but for them this is at a later stage. For the new attempters, for the students who scored below 40, this is a strategy that they should use, but at a later stage. The first thing, they should cover the C part, that's the understanding of the whole paper, and then move towards how to draft that and using the relevancy concept. Relevancy principle would come by practice. If you ask me that, sir, please give me tips how to ensure this relevancy concept, I would always say that you can understand and excel in this area by practice and practice. So practice would ensure the CWR concept, and it's very important. And so students, I would like to ask you that, did you understand this CWR approach? And how many of you from now onwards would use this approach? And how many of you feel that this approach would work for them? Okay, students. So I would want responses from your side. You can unmute yourselves and you can answer. Students, you can unmute yourselves and you can answer.
Yes, that seems helpful.
Okay. So from now onwards in my crash, that will be either in the mid of November or after that, I would be working on this principle, how to use all these aspects practically, and we would be drafting some answers as well, that what are the drafting techniques for the audit risk, what are the drafting techniques for the internal controls, what are the drafting techniques for audit evidence, one of them that I just showed you here, and how to draft a review and reporting, how to ensure that you have performed. Now flow, what is in here, what is in here, what is in here, what do we have in audit evidence, and finally review and reporting. So a flow from all that. I even have my YouTube videos of the previous September session as well. If students who want to get an understanding of that, they can also refer there. But now I would like to recommend you that in this chat box you would see a WhatsApp chat link. So I would recommend everyone to join this. Reason being that we'll be posting further updates. I'll be posting more on CWR. Students who want to ask me any question on that, on these areas, can reach me on that group, or you can reach me personally. No worries at all, and I would be more than welcome to help you on your with your concerned area. And how to use this CWR approach would be covered via the crash for December. And lastly, I would
Sir,
say yes.
sir, I just want to know, is there any changes that have come up in the study dates or something like in this, like in the taxation part, there is a specific change in the taxation policy, and those questions definitely comes up in the session in the March session, or you can. Is there any changes which have come up in the audit session also
Okay, so
this
the
year?
best part of the audit is it doesn't change frequently. It changes once in a blue moon. So mostly the areas are similar, and if it even changes, it won't have any effect on the other area. So that's the best part of this subject. Students can learn from, if even if they have like 1 year or either 1.5 year old study text, if they want to study from there as well, they can study that. The only difference would be the past papers and other questions. The only difference would be that, but if it comes to the text, it would almost be the same. So there has been no change like since the last year. So there is no change even for the December. But yeah, considering the COVID situations we had and how it had implications on the audit, I would be discussing those in the December session, December crash session. So again,
Thank you, sir.
there is a link here. You can join in. Those students, I saw so many students who are like cleared their queries. That's a very good part. You need to clear your exams. You should clarify your queries if you have. For others who still have some queries, they can reach on that WhatsApp group, uh, and that WhatsApp group would also help you as well. So there would be students of audit and assurance, and all students could interact with themselves, that how they are going to ensure that like for example, how many past papers you can do, which books you need to use, what should be the last month strategy, and how you would excel in yourself in the exam. I would say that students who wants to practice, they should practice in a laptop. I would rather say they should practice on a personal computer. Reason being that you would be examined on a personal computer. So laptops are the keypad of the laptop is a bit different from what we have as the keyboard. So you should be familiar with that as well, and with the screen size, with the seating that you have in your exams. So ensure that you put yourself in the same situation whenever you are answering, that the posture, everything that depends on the exams. So if you simulate that before exam, that would be really really helpful for you in the exam. It would definitely increase your morale and the motivation. Okay, students. So, thank you so much for this session. The main purpose was to clear your queries and the CWR approach, and to give you a brief introduction about this subject. So, thank you so much for joining this session, and you were really a great audience. Any last words or questions you need to ask, so that we can end this session. Any last questions you have or something? Okay, yes. You can ask your questions, you can clear your queries. No, no worries at all. This is basically was the talk to the tutor session, and I want you, if you have any queries, unless you don't come up to me, if you don't raise your query, I won't know that where are you facing, which issue are you facing, and where do you feel that you need to work on. I won't be able to comment the relevant comment. I won't be able to give you a relevant comment. I would only be able to give you a general comment on clearing the papers. Students who have to ask anything other than what we have covered, they can please ask me here or on the WhatsApp or anywhere they want to ask.
I have a question.
Yes.
I got 48 in a first attempt, then I reattempted with more practice, and now this time in recent attempt I got 49. I can't figure out where I'm lacking because when I see the question, I never feel like I don't have the knowledge which the examiner is asking for. I can take the issues in the question easily. And this is the reason that I was not expecting a fail this time. Then according to me, my paper went well. So what do you suggest?
Okay. So 48 in the first
Same
attempt,
here.
48 in the first attempt and 49 in the second attempt. Okay. Firstly, did you simulate the exam or anything? What strategies you used? You did for this paper? Where you studied from? How you studied? How much you studied? What were your strategies? Uh, I would not ask you that how many past papers you did. That's not relevant. But how was your study? How, according to you, rate yourself out of 10. What would you rate yourself?
8 maybe.
8. Okay.
Basically, I did the whole kit. I took tuition, I mean the course from some online teacher,
Okay.
and then I did past papers too.
Okay. So, uh, during your course, when you were studying that, during attempting the past papers in the kit, did you feel any issue?
No, I was very confident about the questions. I mean, I could figure out where the problems. I could do the risk areas easily. Ethics was fine, but then results were not
Okay, I would,
reflecting that.
for you, I would specifically recommend you to get your answers checked by me at least, so I can give you proper like evaluation that what went wrong.
Okay, sir.
49 is basically something that even the moderator and the other examiners would sit and see if there is any by way any chance that we could pass this candidate. So 49 means that there is something that maybe in your drafting skills maybe somewhere a lacking. So if you will get your answers checked by me, I'll definitely let you know. Any other question you have?
No, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. What about others? Do you have any question?
No, sir, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Hope this session would have helped you, and definitely the CWR approach would be able to modify your strategies and the way now you will look for this subject. Uh, but please do join this WhatsApp group. We'll be sharing updates here as well. Uh, I'll be there on complete basis so that you can ask me any questions if you have, and I would be updating the crash related material as well as crash related things here as well, that when we are expecting to have a crash for this paper. And since it's a free crash, so everyone can enroll for this. We'll be announcing the crash later on. Uh, Most probably it would be after 15th. Other than this, specifically, if some students want to ask me what strategies should they use now, because now we are like almost a month left with the exams, and since the dates have been announced, from the exam would start from 7 December, and most of the exam would be center based. So it's a good news for some students that most of the students that backed from the September exams just because the environment was quite different from them and it was quite challenging from some students. So again, you will have the center-based exam, so good strategy by ACCA and even helpful for the students, but again maintaining the SOPs. So you can refer me, you can ask me anything that you want with respect to this subject, with respect to this approach. Okay, students, so thank you so much. Please do join this WhatsApp group and I'll be sharing the links elsewhere as well. So thank you so much for this session and you have been a very, very great audience. Thank you. Bye-bye.